Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Law of the Empire. I'm your host, Reyna, and today's episode is super exciting because we're joined by Albert Cano, who is a PhD student from the School of London Economics, and he is specializing in international relations. He looks at war and conflict, peace building, Latin America, and political psychology. He's super educated, and I really enjoyed my conversation with him. I know you will all learn so much from this conversation. So, without further ado, here's Albert. Hi, so could you tell me a bit about yourself, your research, what you're currently doing right now?
Yes, well, a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very
Me
much.
too.
I am a PhD candidate at the Department of International Relations of the London School of Economics, and my research looks at trauma and the effects of liberal ideology in post-conflict societies. And my main case study right now is Northern Ireland, where I lived for more than a year, doing fieldwork, and also in a smaller scale, Colombia, as I'm trying to pivot regionally to Latin America.
So, I think your research examines ideology and trauma shape post-conflict societies. So, can you explain what those mean in simple terms?
Yeah, let me start by a personal example, if I may. So, as you may know, here in Spain, we had a civil war like 90 years ago or so. And my great grandparents, all of them were died out of the as a result of they were in the losing side. So, for instance, I had a one of my great grandfathers was general in the Republican side and died in the sewers of Madrid when the city fell, trying to evacuate the city. And another great grandparent died in in a Nazi concentration camp in France. So what I work on is how these events affect people, ordinary citizens during peacetime after the conflict. So there are several ways to look at it. But for instance, we could look at how this affects their mental health, the mental health of the continuing generations, but also the effects in socio-economic terms, and how for generations it is difficult for the descendants of the losing side, for instance, or any side, if there's an agreement, the problems that they may face during the peace. Another example, and this is in my thesis. In Northern Ireland, there was a 30-year conflict, civil war between two sides, a Protestants and loyalist side that wanted to remain in the UK, and a Catholic Irish Republican side that wanted to unify with Ireland. This is in very simple terms and very brief. In 1998, there was a peace agreement, and since then, the conflict has been stabilized. But we observed that right after, in the years after the peace agreement, the rate of suicides doubled uh, in comparison to previous years and in comparison to other regions in the UK. So Northern Ireland is a good case to look at this because it is still within the UK, and other regions of the UK were not at war, but in conflict. They did suffer the effects of the conflict, but they were not conflict zones or conflicts context. So we can compare what happened in Northern Ireland right after the peace agreement and what happened in England, Scotland, and so on. And we do see an increase that doubles the rate of suicides to the point that in the almost 30 years after the peace agreement, there have been more deaths by suicides than victims of the conflicts. The conflict in Northern Ireland is called the Troubles. So these are examples of how the violence of the conflicts, what we call physical violence, may stop. There's the armed struggle stops, but the violence kind of transforms and spills over into the peace. So this would be basically what I'm working on.
That's really interesting. So basically, despite what most people believe that it's just like the war and then it's all like healing and all like bringing like everything back to normal. In fact, a lot of people face the results of the war like mentally, like for many, many years later. It's not just the war, it's like a whole other like battle kind of after the war is over, which is so fascinating. I never thought about it like that.
Hmm.
Wow. So you've done field work in the US, Northern Ireland, and Colombia. What have been the biggest surprises or challenges in these contexts?
Well, as a researcher, when you go to these places, you have uh, perhaps not as much in the US or Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland more than the US, but what you the two main concerns that you find yourself in is that of access and that of security, this your own security. Um, so let's start with the second one. So first, yeah, as a researcher, first you have to protect yourself,
Mhm.
and then you have to protect also your research participants. So this is a very lengthy, costly, and something that you do need to invest in terms of time and sometimes if in money. So you might be tempted to trade off security for a cheaper accommodation or in a cheaper zone. You should not do that. Um, but then the second word would be access to the people that matter, access to the archival sites if you're doing archival research. This is super important. And when you start a PhD, this is something that you don't realize, that you don't know, you're not aware of how important it is to gain access and to bypass gatekeepers. And this is something that sometimes you do need to be uh, in the fields and start kind of navigating that and try to start snowballing interviews and so on. So it is it in all of those places. I was surprised by how difficult it is to gain access. Yes, and so you need a lot of planning, a lot of patience, and as a by the way, a researcher at the University of Chicago, Lisa Wedin, she told me once, do not take no for an answer. So you find yourself sometimes thinking as if you're a journalist trying to in search of the story, in search of the next clue or something like this. So this makes the research very rewarding in a sense, but you do need a lot of planning to ensure that you're safe and ensure that you have access to the important places.
So how did you, or how were you able to go or like have access to these important places if they were kind of restricted or blocked off in some sort of way?
So the problem is not that they are, it's the problem is not that as much as that you don't have physical access as much as that there are gatekeepers that prevent you from accessing certain information. So, for instance, in Northern Ireland, I found a lot of suspicion, a lot of distrust. So you need to a way to open a path is to manage a first interview with someone who is relevant. And then they will refer you to someone else, and then they will refer you to someone else. And this way, because you need a guarantee for their trust, the trust of your informants, the trust of your research participants. So this is kind of like a journalist task. Of course, there's the previous work that I mentioned is this ethics review, or that every reputable university will have, in the sense that you will have to prepare a very fleshed out report on how you intend to carry out your research in an ethical way, protecting yourself, protecting your informants, in terms of confidentiality, anonymity, data protection, and so on. So you need a lot of preparation. This can last months, because then they get back to you and say, we don't like this, please rework this, and so on. So and so if you have this well prepared, you just contact them and say, look, this is my info sheet, this is my consent form, so this is backed ethically and so on, institutionally. You will be protected in terms of anonymity, confidentiality, data protection. This kind of eases the access a little bit, but again, to gain trust, you need time there. So short stays are not very. You don't get a lot of from them. You do need time there.
Okay, got it. That's really interesting. So, how do ideologies and historical trauma interact in shaping post-conflict peacebuilding efforts?
Right. So in terms of ideology, so when I say ideology, so I try to distinguish between what I call positive ideologies, in the term of, so ideology is a term that in the conflict and peace literature is very much dealt with and defined, and it's very important. But it refers to these worldviews, or ways of understanding themselves that certain groups might have. For instance, insurgent groups, if they are driven by an ideology, that means that they see themselves as their own constituency, a delimited group, delimited by their ideas, assumptions, their own culture. That also ideology then also marks it delimits what they lack. So they lack rights, or they have grievances or inequality or whatever. And so that leads to their goals as a group, and also the strategies, the tactics, the practical strategies that they might have to achieve those goals, which may include violence or non-violent means. This is what we call what I would refer to as positive ideology. So they have positive content, substantial content. They have principles and so on. But then there's another use of the term ideology that I would call negative ideology, in the sense that it doesn't have a positive content, but it's the ways in which our perception of the world is kind of distorted. So, to put it in simple terms, the way in which we fail to see certain phenomena, or we fail to recognize them as important phenomena of violence, of conflict, and so on. For instance, what we said about suicide. So, we suicides in Northern Ireland, we know that it is a problem, but if we do not, we may fail to look at it from a conflict point of view, as resulting or being compounded as an effect by the conflict that was there. For instance, again, in my own family history, all the problems that there might have been in terms of mental health, for instance, drug addictions in any family, we should problematize them as being also again compounded by this transgenerational trauma resulting from the Civil War. So this is what I mean by ideology. How how we look at things that are problems, but we do not see them as problems, but we kind of naturalize them, we normalize them. We see them, yeah, this is something that happens. Let's just move on. So no, ideology makes us see them as non-problematic or as problematic in another way. So this is how I try to see. This is how I try to problematize peace processes as being inherently impacted by this ideological gaze and by the trauma of the conflict that we fail to see, that we fail to recognize, but that it is very present there in during peacetime.
Okay, got it. So we shouldn't really overlook what caused people to behave a certain way or like have trauma instead of it just being like surface level, like, oh yeah, like they have substance abuse or they have an alcohol addiction. We should instead look at the root cause and be like, maybe it's from this trauma that they have, and how can we work to resolve this trauma instead of working to resolve the alcohol addiction itself at the surface level, right?
Exactly. So this in psychiatry, for instance, there's two ways of looking at what they call a symptom, so or a psychic symptom, something that doesn't work, so something that disturbs your everyday life, right? So on the one hand, you can look at it as a deficit, so something that doesn't work and that needs to be fixed, that needs to be removed, and so on. Or looking, and this is the other side of it, looking at the symptom, the problem, as actually a defense mechanism from something else that's happening, that's something else that's disrupting your everyday life and experience. So, for instance, there in my interviews in Northern Ireland, talking with mental health carers, they mentioned quote unquote the clinical ideology in mental health caring, meaning we try to address the symptom in itself through medication or even through therapy or but in doing so they compartmentalize the problem and do not and fail and they and in so doing they fail to relate it to as you mentioned, other causes or mechanisms. So, of course, the conflict in Northern Ireland is not the only cause of the high rate in suicides, but they definitely compound the problem. So we need this holistic look that considers, okay, what is this symptom? What is this problematic phenomena? What is this social problem masking or concealing? Perhaps it's concealing another more inherent problem, and that is what we should be addressing. For instance, in Northern Ireland, definitely this is my thesis, that the peace process has failed to address the root causes of the problem, which is the relation between Catholics and Protestants, between loyalists and Republicans, in the terms of an inherent incompatibility. In the terms they have tried to implement reconciliation policies, but they in the end are not working. They still have a very much segregated society at all levels, political, educational, urban, even. Yeah, perhaps this speaks again to an element that we fail to see due to an ideological gaze, which is we fail to see that actually there's an incompatibility there. So perhaps we should change the angle or of how perhaps we should kind of like the philosopher Zizek says to tarry with the negative, to stay with the problem and instead of trying to reconcile it, trying to believing in our capacity to solve it in positive terms, or just trying to see, okay, what is the real problem? that the apparent problem is masking.
So, how do you propose that we try and fix the problem, I want to say, or like
Hmm.
get people to like reconcile with each other on like a deeper level than just the surface level that you were saying happens in most cases?
Yes. Well, I am very much a pessimist, as you may gauge. But pessimist in a productive sense, I hope, which is, for instance, in peace operations during along the years from international actors like the UN, the EU, or states like the US, the UK, interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, or all over the world. Um, Ever since the since the end of the Cold War, there was this policy called the liberal peace or liberal internationalism, and it was this belief that well, there is conflict in these countries because they are not liberal democracies. They do not have our political system. That is a political system that has no place for this kind of violence. It's a political system that believes in human rights and democracy and such values. So if we import this model of governance, uh, we will conflicts will tend to disappear. Well, the history of peace operations in the last, let's say, 50 years has been a history of failure after failure after failure, of how, yes, in some cases we can eradicate physical violence, that is the actual exchange of armed violence. But a lot of other issues that are in themselves violence, they get perpetuated, they get reproduced, such as inequality and so on. For instance, in Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Latin American countries, there were conflicts in the previous century, and around the 80s and 90s, they all had peace processes. What happened there, and this is something that has happened both in Colombia and Northern Ireland, is that while the exchange of violence between, for instance, the forces of the state, army, police, and so on, and insurgent groups, rebel groups, paramilitary groups, this violence has disappeared, has stopped. And this piece has opened opportunities for certain elites and conflict actors to carry out other activities that are criminal activities. So, for instance, drug trafficking. And we've seen this in all of these countries. So this is what I mean by a violence transformation. So the armed violence transforms into another kind of violence, be that criminal violence or a high rate of suicides, which I would claim that is a kind of what we call structural violence or social violence. So yeah, that's I
Okay.
forgot what you asked at the beginning. So.
I feel like you answered it perfectly. So, how do post-conflict societies deal with perpetrators of violence? And what's the impact of those choices on long-term stability?
So this is a great question. So I once interviewed a person who was an actual had a role in the negotiation in the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, and he told me a sentence that has stayed with me, which was, I don't know if he took it somewhere, but it's a peace deal or a peace agreement is the art of the possible. That means that again, a peace deal has to tarry with the negative, meaning we need to make trade-offs. The perfect peace agreement doesn't exist. Always someone will lose. And the hope is that in both parties or all parties losing something, they will all gain something else that offsets the loss or the sacrifice. Um, So, for instance, in Northern Ireland, one of those trade-offs was that the paramilitary prisoners would be released early from prison. This was hugely problematic, especially at the level of mental health and trauma for victims of the violence. Even if they themselves might agree with this, I mean, the peace agreement was approved by a by a good majority in a referendum. Most of the victims agreed to it. But the issues again is that there is a short-term immediate advantage, which is that we signed the agreement, we stop the violence, but there's a long-term trade-off that slowly undermines the long-term balance itself. So in the end, and this is again a sentence that one of my informants told me, the very measures put to have peace undermine the peace. So again, there's this contradiction and this logic of contradiction and so on. So this is something that it's very difficult to deal. What we do with perpetrators, what we do with ex-combatants. So the the general rule of thumb would be accountability and restorative justice as much as possible. But there will be always a trade-off there. So there are cases in which perhaps leaders were condemned, but there are many um, lower tier perpetrators that are never account for their crimes. And this is again something that is very problematic, but it is very difficult to address. So we have still a lot of work in that regard.
Yeah, totally. So my last question for you is what books or articles do you recommend to high schoolers or college students that are interested in this topic?
Great. So I thought hard about this. What immediate what it came out what I thought of in the end was there's this series of collection from the Oxford Press called the Very Short Introductions. They are very small books. Perhaps you've heard about them, or you've seen them. They are very short books that are very introductory, very easy to read, um, and there are many about many topics. So there's one on Northern Ireland specifically, for instance. So I would recommend that one if someone was interested in Northern Ireland. There's I think one in Latin America or Latin American politics, but there is one specifically written by one of my favorite scholars. The book is called A Very Short Introduction to Peace, as easy as that, by Oliver Richman.
Okay,
He's
perfect.
he's what we call a critical scholar. And another one would be the Very Short Introduction to International Security, which is more broadly speaking about war and peace, but not only war and peace.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll definitely look into these books. They sound so interesting. So, thank you so much for doing this with me. I learned so much from this conversation. Like, I feel so educated on this topic now, and I'm sure everyone else does too.
Well, thank you very much.
Let's give one big final thanks to Albert for coming on to the podcast. I learned so much from my conversation with him, and I feel as though my knowledge about war and conflict and peace building has grown exponentially due to my conversation. If you guys enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow Law of the Empire on Instagram and Spotify. And don't forget to tune in because new episodes drop every other Wednesday. I hope you all have such a great day. And until next time, bye!